1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. All right, welcome to the second day of our first Revenue Interim Committee meeting, held both on-site in Lander, in Cheyenne, and on Zoom. Josh, if you would call the roll.
All right, Mr. Chairman. Senator Baldwin.
Present.
Senator Beitman.
Here.
Senator Driscoll.
Here.
Senator Ellis.
Present.
Representative Blackburn. Representative Blackburn is here.
Is here.
Representative Connolly.
Here.
Representative Dayton Selman.
Here.
Representative Halliday. Representative Halliday. I see he's present.
Markimus.
I'm here.
Representative Roscoe.
Here.
Representative Sweeney.
Here.
Representative Western.
Here.
Co-chairman Case.
Present.
And co-chairman Zwanitzer.
Here.
Representative Larson's here.
Oh, sorry, I skipped you, Representative Larson.
Thank you.
All right, committee, first up this morning, we have Mr. Watkins, who was not able to testify yesterday and is asked to talk to the committee for about 3 to 5 minutes regarding the revenue picture and what this committee can do to help people throughout Wyoming. So Mr. Watkins, welcome to the Revenue Committee. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and I won't take 5 minutes. I'll make it quick. I'm a Wyoming small business located in Jackson, Wyoming. We employ 11 people. Most of them are virtual around the state, around the region. And much of our business is online. We're not a retailer. We deliver our services, our development, professional development and coaching services virtually to customers all around the country. Obviously, in the last 60 days, all of us have experienced a big change in our businesses, as has of our customers. And we've seen a 40%, we saw an initial 40% drop in revenue, and we've clawed our way back to where we're almost par to where we were in January. But we've utilized a lot of our cash on our balance sheet, our emergency cash, to keep our team employed so that our team continued to deliver services as expected to our customers. None of our customers left us. Our customers just couldn't pay us. And so we ended up scholarshiping people or whatever was most appropriate to them. Why am I telling you all that? Because we kept all 11 of our employees fully paid, and we did not cut any hours. I did terminate my salary, so I haven't taken a pay cut since February. Why is that relevant? Because I don't employ W-2s. I employ 1099s. So I only have one W-2 and I have 10 1099s. The struggle that I'm in right now is that originally, as designed, or as we heard back in February, 1099s and W-2s would receive PPP funding. That changed on the fly and 1099s were excluded. So what I'm asking the committee to consider, as perhaps you move forward in helping through the Wyoming grants that or loans that are coming, or if you're communicating to Washington, we would like to, I would like to highlight that there are many of us out there who either employ many 1099s, 50% 1099s, or a smattering of them. And we, the company, have not received any assistance during this difficult time. Now, you would say, yes, but we helped 1099s, and that is true. My 1099s have received, most of them have received, we've helped them receive their individual PPP money, but that money does not help me. I can't ask them to donate their money to me. The optics on that is terrible, and they need the money anyway. Their husbands might have lost a job, their wife might have lost a job. So it's really not appropriate for me to tap into that PPP money. What I needed was that PPP money to be directed to me so that we could then extend our financial cash runway to continue to have them employed, to continue to pay them full, to keep them off of unemployment. And I think that was the original objective. So all I want to do is highlight that we are struggling. We are fighting like hell. So we're definitely not giving up. We've not laid anybody off. We've not furloughed anybody. I've recapitalized the company with some of my own personal funds. And I want to tell you, there's a lot of us out there who considered 1099s in the same capacity, although not legally, but we depend on them as much as we do our W-2s. We don't see them as workers that we can just cut at a whim. And I'd ask the committee to consider that as you move forward to help us. I know you're doing a great job. I appreciate everything you've done so far. And were you to address this small issue, it would even be an enhancement to what you're already doing.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Watkins. Committee, any questions? Representative Connolly, go ahead.
Oh, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Watkins, you're gone. Oh, I see you again. Mr. Watkins, know that the Wyoming Business Council will be standing up 3 programs, and I believe they'll be stood up next week. And please take a look at them. One of them should be able to help you. If not, honestly, give me or anybody here a call, because they are designed to help small businesses like yours. And thank you.
Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you very much. And I'm sad to even waste your time here with this small issue, but it's a big issue to us. And we cherish the people. I have people who've worked with me. The company is 10 years old. After I sold my former companies, I started this one. I've got tenure here, and I can't envision not having them part of this company. And there's reasons why they're 1099s. It's just a lifestyle choice for them, but we do treat them very importantly. And were you to help us, it would be deeply appreciated. And so thank you for listening. I'll let you get on to business, and I will reach out if we're struggling. I appreciate that invitation.
Well,
Thank you
very
for
much.
letting me join today.
Thank you for joining us. And I also check with the executive branch and have them, I have your email address on file, and we'll have them reach out as well, as we've taken that portion of the funding and let the executive branch be primarily in charge of it. But working with our federal partners, I don't know if this committee can, revise things quickly enough. But I would expect the possibility of the executive branch having that flexibility and the Department of Workforce Services next week. So I will make sure they reach out to you as well, and appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you all. It's lovely to see politics in motion. I'm grateful to be in the inner circle for a few minutes.
We appreciate
Have a great
it.
day. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
All right, committee, thank you for letting Mr. Watkins address us. We missed out on him yesterday. With that, we will move into a discussion of our state fiscal structure. Joining us today is Mr. Richards from LSO, as well as I think Mr. Noble from the Department of Revenue, and Mr. Temte from LSO. Let me welcome Don, our budget and fiscal manager first. Mr. Richards, any opening comments? Are you guiding us through this portion of the presentation?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Don Richards, Legislative Service Office Administrator of Budget and Fiscal Division. Dane and I have a short PowerPoint. I think it's only 6 slides, and I believe Director Noble also has a PowerPoint. We're happy to proceed at your direction.
This committee loves PowerPoints. So committee, any opening questions? I'm not seeing any, so Mr. Richards, Representative Sweeney.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman. So Don or Dean, I'm unsure what your presentation looks like. Is it the state fiscal structure presentation? Okay, thank you, Don.
All right, and we've enabled you to share your screen as well, Mr. Richards. So at your convenience, take it away.
Well, good morning, members of the committee. I thought I would begin by addressing Representative Roscoe's question from yesterday. I believe he inquired about a short history of what budget reductions had been enacted in the previous several years. And the most recent spate of budget reductions commenced in 2015 when we had a downturn in state revenue. And in particular, the Joint Appropriations Committee spearheaded those reductions, which included a 2-year penny plan, which was a 1% reduction in fiscal year 16, followed by a second 1% reduction in fiscal year 17. They also reduced all in-state and out-of-state travel for all state agencies by 10%. They reduced all the 900 series, which is external contracts, by 5%, and permanent vehicle assignments by 2.5%. Then over the summer of 2016, they directed the governor to make a number of budget reductions. This was under the Meade administration, and Governor Meade and his staff cut $249 million. The average impact to state agencies was 8%. There were some agencies that were treated more aggressively than that. For instance, the governor's office took greater than a 10% budget reduction. There were some agencies, such as the judiciary, that were spared from the full 8% reductions. In this time period, that's the 17-18 biennium, there were limited programs that were reduced or eliminated. But I thought I would touch on those. The adult literacy program, which was administered by the Community College Commission, was eliminated. The tax refund for elderly and disabled, administered by the Department of Health, was eliminated. The property tax relief program in the Department of Revenue was eliminated. The livestock investors or investigators program was not eliminated, but extraordinarily downsized down to, I believe, one investigator. The county consensus funding was eliminated, and what remains now for local governments is just the direct distribution funding. The community facilities program in the Wyoming Business Council was eliminated, and the BRC Business Ready Community Program was reduced. Around the same time, there was also a number of agencies that were moved off of general funds. For example, the Board of Control was shifted on to water development funding. The Wyoming Department of Transportation and the Game and Fish were shifted off of general funds and are now supported with their own revenues. There were dozens of individual positions that were eliminated in the intervening period between 2018 and 2020, but there have not been across the board budget reductions on the state government side since those 8% budget reductions in the 17-18 biennium. Shifting to the K-12 budget reductions, they also commenced in 2016 by an impact to the ECA. That ECA was reduced in fiscal year 2017, and it was eliminated ultimately in fiscal year 2018. After that, there were a number of individual components that were revised in the K-12 model, including non-personnel components that were priced at the consultants level that reduced the overall funding provided to K-12. There was a reduction in transportation operations to equal the average of the prior 3 years. There was a modification of how the ADM was calculated. There was a reduction of the instructional facilitator program and no longer became a categorical grant program. There were also eliminations of the non-school site groundskeepers and a 10% allocation for non-school sites based on school size. In the most recent session in 2020, you reduced by half the amount of health insurance that is provided to employees who are not signed up for health insurance, and that is inclusive of vacant positions. So that's kind of a broad overview of some of the budget reductions that were taken in the last 4 to 5 years. Jumping into the PowerPoint presentation, the first slide or the second slide on our presentation is a response perhaps to Representative Connolly's question from yesterday, which outlines the account balances for the major reserve funds. So these are the anticipated account balances. Actually, as of June 30, 2022, we've updated that. So the LSRA has just shy of $1 billion we anticipate. SIPA is at 169 million. You can see the two reserve accounts for the spending policy in the Permanent Wyoming Mineral Trust Fund and the Common School Permanent Land Fund. The Permanent Mineral Trust Fund we anticipate will drop down below 30 million and about 125 million for the Common School Permanent Land Fund. At the bottom of the page in column 1 is the Water 3 and Water 1 accounts. We anticipate balances of 23 and 22 million respectively. And then on the bottom right-hand side is the Water 2 account, a much smaller account. We anticipate a available balance of $2 million. Then on most of the right-hand side of the page are constitutional or statutorily protected reserve accounts, including $8 billion in the PMTF, 600 million in the Hathaway Scholarship, 122 in the Excellence for Higher Education. Those are constitutionally protected and committed to specific purposes. The Tobacco Settlement Trust Fund has $86 million. That is not a constitutionally protected trust fund, but it is statutorily protected. An act of the legislature could modify that and make those funds available. And then finally, similar, the Transportation Trust Fund of $23 million is also statutory, not constitutionally protected. So these are the major trust funds and available reserves. It is not all of them, but the Joint Appropriations Committee does review roughly 600 accounts on an annual basis. At least they receive the information on those accounts. Over the past 8 years or so, they have taken a more aggressive tone in reviewing those. And you can recall identification of excess funds in the Child Care Fund, which then Chairman Tony Ross identified and I wouldn't say liquidated, but reduced. And then also the Buffalo Bill water account was also identified and reduced. Responding to some questions yesterday, you'll recall the $877 million shortfall that is anticipated based upon May 2020 CRAIG. We tried to graphically depict what that is the equivalent of. And as I mentioned yesterday in my remarks, that blue cell in the top right portion of the graph is all of the appropriated personnel expenses for state government. So this does not include higher education. Those are block grants and they appear in the green portion to the left of the graphic. But all of the generally funded personnel, which would include the Department of Revenue, the Department of Audit, the Attorney General's Office, the Department of Corrections, that's the equivalent for 2 years of funding of the magnitude of our projected budget shortfall. If you don't want to look at the personnel portion, it's a little bit more than half of all grants and aids. Grants and aid general fund comes in the form of the block grants to higher education, as well as Medicaid services, mental health and substance abuse services, grants to local governments through the Business Council for Business Ready Communities are other examples of that green portion. And then if you wanted to reduce everything else, which is kind of the standard approach by prior Joint Appropriations Committees. For example, as I mentioned, they reduced out-of-state travel or equipment expenditures or IT expenditures. And those are all lumped in the bottom right-hand portion, several different colors, red, orange, purple, brown, yellow. All of those combined would be about 2/3 of the amount necessary if the legislature desired to use only budget reductions to address the budget shortfalls. We could also look at this same breakout by agency. And it turns out that roughly 1/3 or 877 million is the equivalent of the middle two boxes. That is all of justice and corrections, public safety, higher education, which is inclusive of both University of Wyoming and community colleges. That's about equal to the amount of money that we're contemplating here, 877 million. You can see on the far left-hand side, the Department of Health actually receives about $100 million more than the target amount of shortfalls. So it would, if the committee desired to reduce the Department of Health, it would take about 90% of their funding to address the shortfall. Or you could move to everything else, which is all of the general government, capital construction, Department of Family Services, economic development, natural resources, that's state parks, Department of Environmental Quality. All of those smaller boxes on the right-hand side are the equivalent of roughly the amount of the $877 million projected shortfall. With there, I will pause for questions, and I think Mr. Temte has the next couple of slides.
Any questions from the committee, Senator Case?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, maybe Mr. Richards could tell us where the transfers to local government fit in. Is that a grant and aid, or how does that work? And that's I've got several people in this room that are from local governments in Fremont County, and so they'd sure like to know which box they're in.
Mr. Richards.
Excellent point, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chairman. That is in the grants and aid. However, in the last 4 years, local government funding does not come from the general fund anymore. It is funded entirely through the LSRA through a direct appropriation of $105 million. So that technically is not part of the current shortfall because it's already being funded with reserve funds, not general funds.
Technically rainy day funds that we're funding local government with currently. Representative Connolly, question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Richards, I'm curious about where we see some of the other kind of accounts or what we call coffee cans and how much are in those. So for example, I know that we've been putting money away for potentially building a new prison. We also have the Miners Hospital Fund. Where are those accounts and how much are in them and are they tappable?
Mr. Richards.
Sure. Mr. Chairman, Representative Connolly, those accounts are articulated in the data book. There's a section included there. We also update that chart on a maybe 6-month basis or so. I would be happy to send that to the committee. It's rather lengthy. The 2 examples that you give are just 2 of about 600 different accounts. The vast majority of those accounts are dedicated to a specific purpose. When you mentioned the penitentiary fund, you're exactly right. The statute requires a $10 million deposit to that account on an annual basis. I believe those deposits will begin this year, will be the first deposit. So at the end of this calendar or end of this fiscal year, there will be the initial $10 million deposit to that account. As to the Miners Hospital, there are 2 funds there. There is a permanent fund, which is in violet, and then there is an income account, which benefits from the proceeds of the permanent fund. Those 2 are about the same size. I believe, I could be wrong, but I believe there's about $30 million in each of them. And they are constitutionally and in fact, through our act of admission, protected for the purposes of minors with health challenges. There are a slew of additional accounts, and I'd be happy to send the committee that full list. There are, opportunities in there. It's kind of small change compared to the amount that we're contemplating here. The governor discussed this with me in recent conversation, and he said, well, the Joint Appropriations Committee has grabbed the state by the ankles, turned it upside down, and shook all the change out of its pockets. And that was his description of how the Joint Appropriations Committee, particularly under Chairman Ross, went through each of those accounts and tried to identify whether or not funds could be shifted to the general fund or used for other purposes or that sort of thing.
Mr. Chairman,
Representative Hallinan? Oh, you want to follow up, Representative Connolly?
I'd just
Go
like
ahead.
to say thank you, Mr. Richards, and I would like to see that again. And I mean, I appreciate the turning around and shaking, but I also like to squeeze the turnip too. So see what else is out there.
Okay, Representative Hallinan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Don, would you send us copies of those nice colored graphs that you presented earlier? Would you have them mailed to us?
Mr. Richards?
Absolutely.
Okay. Any further questions before we turn it over to Mr. Tempty? Seeing none at this time, go ahead, Dean.
Good morning, Chairman Zwanitzer. Good morning, Chairman Case. Good morning, members of the committee. The next slide, slide number 5. This slide shows the results of a revenue volatility analysis that was performed by LSO in regard to all of the state's major revenue streams. It includes not only revenue streams regarding taxes, but also other items in investment income, federal mineral royalties, and COLE's bonus. This analysis was performed An analysis was performed to measure the year-over-year average change of all these revenue streams to the various accounts. All the various accounts are listed along the left side of this graphic, and the revenue streams themselves are listed across the top. And it ranks each one of these revenue streams as far as from modestly volatile to extremely volatile. And also a few of them are considered to be in cyclical decline. I'll start at the left-hand side of the graphic where it talks about federal mineral royalties, severance taxes, and state royalties. This analysis indicated that while these revenue streams aren't the most volatile that the state has, they still are extremely volatile. And the thing that all of these revenue streams have in common is they involve revenue commodity or mineral commodity pricing. Both federal mineral royalties, severance taxes, and state royalties are heavily influenced by mineral commodity prices, oil, gas, and coal to be the ones that drive the majority of these revenue streams. You'll also see included in this chart COLE's bonus and investment income. These two categories of revenues are considered to be extremely volatile, or the most volatile, if you will. You will remember the COLE's bonus revenue stream, which really the state has not seen significant COLE's bonus revenues for quite a few years now. That revenue stream was subject to actions by the federal government to actually hold COLE sales, and also dependent on mineral companies desiring to lease additional federal property. As far as the investment income goes, this one is part of the reason this one is so considered extremely volatile is because of it also includes capital gains. You will remember that the Consensus Revenue Estimating Group does not project capital gains, but only interest and dividends. But since this revenue stream is also the recipient of investment income from capital gains. That's one thing that makes this revenue stream extremely volatile. As you work towards the right end of this graphic, you will start seeing revenue streams that are considered modestly volatile. That includes fuel tax, alcohol taxes, sales and use taxes, and ad valorem tax. While ad valorem tax does have, it will share some of the volatility that revenue streams regarding minerals will experience. It also experiences a more, it is also a more steady revenue stream because of the property taxes assessed on non-mineral properties, on 9.5% property, residential, commercial, industrial properties. Don, if you would go on to the next slide. This slide.
Mr. Chairman, I was hoping I could ask a question on the previous slide.
Sure, go ahead, Senator Case.
And I apologize, we didn't get the ground rules in ahead, and I hope, Mr. Temke, this is okay. Looking at these categories of revenues, I note that you have an asterisk with respect to the, we've got red with cyclical decline, both on the tobacco tax. That's interesting to me, but I would think the things like coal lease bonuses, you talked about them being lots of volatility. I would also advance that there is a structural decline in that the world is moving away from coal. Our nation is moving away from coal. Certainly the electric utilities where that coal goes have retirement. So it's volatile, but it's also trending downward in a very structural sense. I don't know if we call it cyclical. I don't think it's cyclical. I think it's a structural decline. That might be a different way of looking at this too. Not only is it volatile, but it's on the decline. That could be true of other carbon-based minerals as well. We don't know that, but that would put severance taxes in the same kind of thinking long term. Did you look at it that way? And maybe I jumped the gun. I'm sorry.
Mr. Temke, if you have thoughts.
Chairman Case, and you know, actually, I think I neglected to mention the cyclical decline in regard to the tobacco tax. That is just a particular revenue stream which has declined steadily over the years. In regard to your comments regarding coal lease bonus, I could certainly see that particular category being categorized as you described, not only extremely volatile, but also in a decline, and perhaps not cyclical, but structural as you described.
All right, thank you, Dean. Proceed.
Thank you, Chairman Zwanitzer. This final slide, there was some discussion about this yesterday, and this slide is discussing, I guess you would say, the speed in which additional revenues could be raised from particular revenue streams. There was discussion yesterday in regard to sales and use taxes and food exemptions. This is a particular category which changes to that revenue stream could become effective within months. I believe Director Noble mentioned that there would be about a lag of perhaps a calendar quarter in order to notify vendors of the appropriate or any changes to tax rates. But sales and use taxes and exemptions to sales and use taxes is one where the revenue stream could be modified or rates could be changed, and the timing and the state could see those changes within months of the change that could be executed. Categories of that: sales and use taxes or exemptions to those, fuel taxes as well. I spoke to my contact at the Department of Transportation this morning. They recalled that the last time the fuel taxes were increased back in 2013, that those increases in fuel taxes started showing up within about 3 months. In regard to severance taxes, if changes to severance tax rates were put into place, that is one that would be relatively quick as well. Severance taxes are due to the Department of Revenue 1 month and 25 days after the end of the month of production. So this is another one which would fit into the category of a change to those taxes could be experienced within months rather than years. As far as the categories at the bottom of this slide, however, Mr. Chairman, there was also discussion yesterday how changes to specifically to property taxes, to mill levy rates, to the change in assessment ratio, those changes would take longer for this to yield a change in revenues. For example, all property is assessed at a January 1 assessment date, and ultimately those payments for property assessed at that January 1 assessment date don't begin to show up until the following November, and actually after that, the following May. So there's a little bit more of a lag time to changes in regard to property taxes having to do with mill levies and changes to assessment ratios. The last bullet on here, there's been a lot of discussion in regard to the implementation of a corporate income tax or individual income taxes by this committee. And however, this is another what these are also particular taxes which would take longer to put into place. For example, there currently is not an income tax division within the Department of Revenue. The administration of those particular taxes would have to be stood up, and as well wait for a particular effective date of those new taxes, which would result in a lag from the state seeing additional collected revenue from those revenue sources.
Okay, committee, any questions for Mr. Tempty on those slides? Giving it a second to see if anyone's hand gets raised. Seeing none at this time. Mr. Richards, anything you needed added to those last slide decks?
Mr. Chairman, I do not.
Okay. With that, we'll move on to Director Noble from the Department of Revenue. Welcome, Director Noble.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dan Noble, Director of the Department of Revenue. I believe Mr. Richards also has my slide deck associated with this, and he was gracious enough to offer to stand that up for me. There it is. Okay. I wanted to kind of present this from a different perspective, and this is a slide or a slide deck, if you will, that the Revenue Committee has seen before. This was presented a couple of years ago, or at least a year ago, in Lander, I believe. And it kind of points to the volatility that we are talking about here today. It describes graphically what our sales and use tax does and how it is somewhat of a slave to our mineral taxation as well. And it kind of gives you a graphical representation of what the structural issue is with our taxes and how that, depending on which county you happen to be in this state, can vary rather dramatically. Don, if you turn to the next slide. Okay, this is a compilation of the not only the state's portion, but the local share of the statewide sales tax. In other words, the 4% that we actually collect. And this slide kind of demonstrates what happens in a mineral downturn. Not only does it impact mineral severance tax revenue, which we're all very aware of, that the mineral severance taxes and the ad valorem taxes on that mineral production are both pretty much subject to commodity pricing and demand. And as such, it's certainly understandable that the severance tax would be something that is impacted significantly by that. But it also does exactly the same thing to our sales tax revenue. You look at if you look at the trend line in the year 2016, when we were suffering some pretty difficult issues in mineral severance taxes, it also had a major impact on our sales tax. And that is demonstrated in other states as well. Don, if you turn to the next slide. Converse County is a county that is heavily weighted in mineral taxation from severance tax from production. But they're also, it's quite obvious that they're also pretty much, their sales tax revenue is harmed, if you will, by that very change in commodity pricing as well. It dips in 2016 and 17, the very times when we were suffering from problems on mineral production in this state. And I use this as an example, these examples as to what actually happens. Don, if you could turn to the next slide. Campbell County, you went one too far. Campbell County, it's is probably as heavily invested as any county in the state in the mineral production, both oil, gas, and coal, major issues. And as you can tell, significant changes in sales tax revenue driven by a change in mineral production as well. Now, the next slide is what points to the fact that not everywhere in this state, if they don't have mineral interest, can actually, if you will, avoid some of the issues that are faced with being tied to mineral production for the majority of our revenue. Teton County is a state that has, for all intents and purposes, no mineral wealth, but has a substantially robust sales tax revenue generation from the tourism industry and other industries there. And they experienced none of the issues that other counties did in the state of Wyoming. Well, most of the counties in the state of Wyoming did when it comes to mineral production and the volatility associated with it. I mean, Don and Dean pointed to just exactly how difficult it is to understand the impact not only on one area of our revenue but also on others. And sales tax revenue, I think, is probably more volatile than it need be, only because of the fact that it is so dependent on our mineral wealth. The next slide that Don has there is Albany County, another county which has relatively minimal mineral production, fairly heavy in sales tax revenue, and show the trends associated with a loss of production. And I think it's critical for us to understand, and the question that has come to the committees in the past is that diversifying our economy into other sectors of our economy is absolutely critical for us to move forward and to deal with some of the problems that we've had with being so dependent upon the mineral economy itself. It's as obvious as living in a county where there isn't mineral production to demonstrate just how different this could be if you depend on other sources of revenue for your government. The next slide is probably the busiest slide I've ever produced, and it is it is a breakdown by major industry code of each and every industry in the state of Wyoming, and that's by year from 2013 through 2019. These are fiscal years, obviously. And it shows what the trends are. Though each one of those lines is a trend line for each of the various NAICS codes out there. And I apologize for the fact that it's a busy slide, but it has an awful lot of information on it. And what it points to, if you're looking at the retail sector is booming, if you will, as it relates to the trend lines. We have other areas of the economy that are actually increasing over that time frame as well, and you have sectors of the economy that are in decline. One of the things that probably is going to be critical to understand is that each of those probably needs to be a sector that we need to either directly attack, if you will, and try to beef up, or recognize that recognize those as opportunities to actually maybe try to provide incentive to get companies to come here.
Mr. Chairman?
Mhm.
Senator Case, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, the slide is kind of hard to follow, and the movements by our staff came at a little different time than Mr. Noble was speaking. But Mr. Noble, can you just start? I'm assuming that the top line is retail, and then the next one down is the mining. Is that what I'm getting here? Maybe just the linear lines, if you just start at the top and say what they are.
Okay, it's probably hard to read, and I think probably one of the best ways to deal with this is that we'll go across the top, and you'll look from left to right. Number 11 is agriculture, and it is next to it's minimal because it doesn't generate an awful lot of sales tax revenue. The next one over, the kind of a yellow color, is mining. The gray is utilities. The yellow is construction. Then you go to the next line down, and the dark blue is manufacturing. The green is wholesale trade, and the kind of bright blue line that is I guess it's probably represents the most sales tax generated from any of it, is the retail trade. And it just goes across and down each category by NAICS code. So you're following from one end to the other for a given year, those NAICS codes, and then it repeats itself for the following year. The lines above it that are the horizontal lines are representing the trend of that particular NAICS code for the number of years that are in the sample, and that is a 7-year period from 2013 through 2019. Does that make sense?
Mr. Chairman, it does make sense, but just like the very top horizontal type line is retail, and it's increasing. That's what you're saying.
That is
and then
correct.
the next line down is mining, and it's strong, but it's decreasing. Is that correct? Is that minerals, all minerals? And just do the same thing for the other horizontal lines.
Okay.
That would help us out.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, that is correct. The next horizontal line down is mining. Then you have, I believe, a gray line, which is utilities, and it's down quite a ways, and it's relatively flat, not necessarily a huge increase in revenue. The following one is a yellow line, and that is construction. Construction is actually almost level, but is trending downward slightly. Okay, manufacturing, very level. The wholesale trade, which is kind of a green colored horizontal line, is fairly strong, but it doesn't generate, it generates tax revenue because even though they're considered in the wholesale NAICS industry, most wholesalers also retail. So you're actually seeing another component of retail. A true wholesale sale is not subject to sales tax, but every every wholesaler also retails as well. This is the way to put it. The other trend lines are, I guess I'd say they're so small that they really don't even show up on the graph. But those are the major sectors and what is happening with each of them. And those are the big contributors to our sales tax revenue in the state. And the entire purpose of this slide was to represent that there may be opportunities for us to look in other areas other than strictly mining to find potential ways to view targeting incentives for a specific type of group that you're trying to gain revenue from. And one of the things that you need to look at here, and this kind of plays into another part of not this presentation, but a different presentation, that is expanding your sales tax base would also impact the way that this graph looks, because some of the NAICS codes in this slide are not contributors to sales tax revenue and very well could be at some point in the future should you decide to go that route, if that makes sense.
Yep.
Okay.
The other, Representative Sweeney has a question. Go ahead, Representative Sweeney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So what is public administration, and is that the one orange line? Yeah, Don, that's.
I understand. Public administration, and you're going to love this. It's another retail sector. It's the sale of automobiles in this state. That is where the majority of the sales tax revenue that you're seeing from public administration is actually the sale of automobiles. So it's another avenue of retail, of the retail sector associated with because of the fact that they're collected by county officials, it's considered public administration revenue.
Okay. Any other questions from the committee at this time? Seeing none. Oh, Representative Connolly, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Noble, can we go back to slide 2? And that was the comparison over the last several years. And I'm just curious, and I was trying to pull up the presentation yesterday with the Craig report and the anticipated sales tax revenue that would be coming in. And I'm curious if you know off the top of your head, which of these bars that we would be most comparable to? Are we going back to a 2016 or 17, or are we staying about the same?
Mr. Noble.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Connolly, along with my testimony of yesterday, trying to determine where we're ultimately going to end up with sales tax revenue is well, it's at this point with one data point in order to try to develop a trend. I'd like to say I don't know. Based on what our best estimate, it will probably be at least as low as 2017, 16, 17 or lower. My guess is probably lower. And the reason being is not only are you impacted by mineral downturns like we are in what you see on that graph on the second page, but we're also going to be impacted by probable issues with tourism, which is another strong sector. You'll probably see Teton County have some major bumps in the tourism trade, and that nice constantly increasing graph is not going to look nearly as nice in Teton County as it was this last year. So you're going to see some major changes there as well. So not only mineral sector, but other sectors are going to be impacted. So I would say, if I had to guess, it's going to be lower than what you see there on a statewide basis.
Follow-up question, Representative Connolly.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Noble, will we expect to see the relative proportions of each of these remain the same? Or are we honestly will we be beginning to see a different level of proportions?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Connolly,
One data point.
This is basically speculation on my part, but I would say, as a semi-educated guess, that you're going to see a different trend because of the fact that you're involving other factors than just minerals that are being impacted by this. You're going to see sales tax revenue from retail suffer from it. You're going to see sales tax revenue from the hospitality industry. Other industries that were showing growth may very well contribute to what this is ultimately going to look like on a graphical representation. I don't think that when we get through FY 2021 that this picture is going to look anything like it does today. It has been harmed by not only the Wyoming economy, but the national economy is going to aid in our problems as well. So I'd say I would expect to see this look different, and by different I mean look worse than it is right now.
And
Mr. Chairman, oh, I'm sorry.
Okay,
sorry,
Representative
Mr.
Conley.
Chairman.
Yep, Senator Case.
When you get done with Representative Conley, who has a follow-up, of course, I know that Representative Sweeney was trying to get your attention.
Thank you. Representative Connolly, go ahead and ask another question. And committee, let me remind you, because it's difficult with a slide presentation up, if you would hit that little blue hand, if you have a question, it's much easier for me to find you than scrolling through everybody's video feed. So Representative Connolly, another question.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Last one. And again, Mr. Noble, on this particular slide, and I'm looking at the lines that actually Senator Case, the slope lines. And I'm curious if you've seen, is it reasonable at all to look at these slopes and see exchanges going on, that our retail trade is going up? It looks to me to be about the same slope, maybe a little bit more than the negative slope that we see in mining.
Mm-hmm.
Is there an exchange that goes on there, or is looking at those slopes and comparing not a reasonable exercise?
I guess one of the things that I would point to, when you look at the retail trade that is in that time frame, now the trend line is actually positive because you've got a really big, strong retail sector in 2019. I think part of that's brought on by the fact that we're now collecting remote sales.
Yep.
The other part of it is if you look at 2016, 17, and 18, it's actually below that trend line, which means it was probably following those same mineral trends during that same time frame. What trend lines do when it's a straight trend line like that one, is it points to the fact that over time you've gone from this particular point in to where you're at in the end. It doesn't really, the trend line doesn't necessarily, or I should say it smooths out the ups and downs. You can see there are times when it's actually above that trend line and when it's below it. If you use a logarithmic trend line, it does tend to smooth some of that out, but it's a kind of this is busy enough. I tried using logarithmic trend lines and it got uglier than it is now. So I wanted to try to maintain as simple a graph as I could, but there's just so much information on it that it's really difficult to explain. But yet I think it's still a useful exercise to see what each sector is doing and how one may contribute to the other.
So Mr. Noble, with that line on retail, does that include any of our online sales from the legislation we passed a year ago? That explains the much larger increase. And so perhaps moving forward, that trend line should even be up further now that we're collecting online taxation sales. Would that be fair?
Mr. Chairman, that is correct. You see such a large spike because we added about another 23 million in taxation on taxes we were unable to collect in the past. And that's actually going to get better this year because I think that that's one sector of the economy that will probably not suffer near as much as some of the other retail trades that are out there. You know, you look at Amazon alone and what's happened to their stock and their sales are going nuts. I think it's going to be an area where you're going to see growth even in a time like this.
Thank you. Representative Sweeney, did you have a question?
No, thank you. Not at this time. The previous question got answered, but thank you.
Okay, any other questions on this slide? Seeing none. All right, keep going, Mr. Noble. Thanks.
Okay, next slide, I'm sorry, Don. This is a slide that demonstrates what the taxable value does for property tax purposes in the state of Wyoming. Each of the different colors there represents a different type of property and what it does, what it contributes to the overall taxable value that we report on an annual basis and again gets taxed by the counties. As you can see, the green portion of that is mineral taxation, and it obviously is subject to the most volatility as it is in the sales tax revenue. So you can see the trends associated with what is happening to property values, and it's driven yet again by the mineral industry and the production values. If you look at everything below that, the trend is actually positive throughout that entire time frame. The actual taxable value of everything but mineral wealth has actually steadily been growing over that same time frame. And each of those sectors is a contributing factor to how we deal with it. And it's one of those areas where there may be opportunities should the government want to take a look at it. The next slide shows how much is contributed by each of the various sectors of property tax value, and the comparison of that from 2008 to 2018. As you can tell, that mineral wealth in the early, or I should say late 2000s, 2008, 2009, represented a large portion of the overall taxable value that is certified to each county. When you go to 2018, it's actually less than half, from 63% down to 48%. And recognize that that doesn't necessarily mean that there's any more tax going to be collected. It's just going to be associated with a smaller proportion from mineral wealth itself. And this slide was just to kind of represent to everyone, it represents just how much of a factor mineral wealth is in the state of Wyoming and what it does to our tax system when it comes time to recognize a lower value and what that does in our ability to collect revenue for the state.
So Mr. Noble, before you leave that slide, but when we've lost that 15% in our assessed mineral valuation, is that in your mind because minerals have gone down in valuation, or is that because we're growing residentially and it's overtaking? You understand what I'm asking, which way and why?
Slight factor in both directions. Mineral wealth is losing a share, not because residential and commercial and industrial is growing at a rapid rate, and it is growing. I will say that it is, but it's mainly because of the fact that we are seeing such dramatic declines. And understand, 2018's property tax valuation was a fairly good year for the mineral industry, but it's nothing compared to what it was in 2008. Our value of our minerals, based on the amount of production and the price of that production, has gone down over that time frame, and it is no longer as large a contributing factor, meaning we're losing money, and that's the obvious piece of it. We're losing money and market share, if you will, associated with the overall basket of goods that are being used for property tax valuation.
Senator, I'm sure we don't want to see that in 2020 this year, the slide. Senator Case, question?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Noble, we know, for example, that coal, I'm not sure what present coal production is for this year, but it's going to be less than 300 million tons. I don't know if it's quite a bit less, but at least 10 or 20 million tons less. And our record year was in excess of 450 million tons. So that's the decline over 10 years in coal. And what most people in Wyoming don't realize is that there's been a decline in the production and valuation of natural gas, which has matched that decline in coal and in some cases exceeded it. And that's why in our revenue forecast from Craig before, we were relying on really oil. And we left the legislature with an oil-based budget and oil-based future that is not materializing. So that is a very real shrink in our mineral revenue. It's not a relative change.
Great. And Representative Sweeney, question?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So how does the legislation that we discussed yesterday, basically on the property tax for mineral companies, trying to get them to a monthly payment system over a period of time, will that create any different modeling in your mind? And some sort of an effect on the green portion, or is that just, would that be a false echo?
Mr. Noble?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Sweeney, whenever you move the timing for when taxation moves backwards or closer to when it was actually assessed, you're going to create a one-time event that will actually provide a little additional revenue. And I'm not going to say it's going to be a huge amount, but it will be a little additional revenue because you'll be getting it sooner than you would have otherwise. The very same thing happened when we went from the modified accrual basis in accounting for governmental entities to the full accrual basis in accounting for governmental entities. There was a one-time bump because that revenue was recognized sooner than it would have been otherwise. You're going to see a slight amount of change because this is going to happen over like a 10 or 12 year period where you'll see a little additional revenue, but I'm not sure that it will be something that will be significant to this model. And once we get to the actual payment on a monthly basis, you won't see any change whatsoever. It'll still be the same model that you're looking at today. It's still going to be a very volatile natured business, and we will still be depending on our tax revenue on the price of a commodity.
Okay. Thanks. All right, next slide.
This is, I believe, the last slide, and what it really points to is where our property taxes are spent. In 2018, the school foundation programs and the other programs associated with public education accounted for 72.81% of total property taxes. Counties was 18.27%, municipalities and special districts was the remainder of it. The point being, our state is extremely tied to, and our budgets are extremely tied to the price of a single part of our economy, and that is the mineral industry. And with the fluctuations that we see, we're going to be tied to this until we can find a way to diversify the economy and create other mechanisms of tax revenue to fund these processes. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll stand for any questions you folks may have.
Questions from the committee? Is that it? Representative Blackburn, do you have a question? No? Anyone else have a question? I think you made it off scot-free, Mr. Noble.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee.
And so members of committee, those are our three presentations regarding kind of our tax structure in Wyoming. Historically, we have had other presentations about our neighboring states, their taxation rates and how they vary and how they're aligned. I think historically, we look at South Dakota as a very similar state to Wyoming if we didn't have the mineral resources and revenues that we have. And so when I look at projections or models, I'm not sure if Mr. Noble just likes Nebraska and South Dakota, but they tend to have those two states in mind, and because they're similar, I think in nature and demographics to our state.
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Noble, do you have another jump in? And then I'll get to Senator Case.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I do actually have another document. It's called Tax Comparison by State. I think it was listed under Tax Studies, but if you're interested in looking at that, it does provide a comparison by state of all the states that do not have an income tax and what their tax structure looks like, and then all of the surrounding states. One of the things I left off of each of these was income tax, because we don't have one, so I didn't look at it for comparison purposes. But at least you have the ability to look at all of the states that have an income tax or that do not have an income tax in the country, and what their tax structures look like versus ours. And then I looked at the surrounding states as well. There is one specific reason I look at South Dakota, and it's because not only are they similarly situated, they have roughly the same population. It's about 300,000 more than ours. They're a rural community, pretty much, just like ours is. They do not have an income tax, either corporate or a state income tax. And the only difference between them and us as it relates to their revenue picture is they don't have mineral wealth. And the reason it made sense to use them is because similar tax structures, how do they balance a budget without mineral wealth, I guess was the way to look at it.
Thank you. Senator Case.
And Mr. Chairman, let me apologize for interrupting for everybody, but because I'm a co-host, I don't have the blue hand function, so I have to kind of get your attention, and I apologize for that. But I was just doing housekeeping. Senator Beitman had a question about folks to be able to participate via the Zoom link. And you might explain how that works, Mr. Chairman, and that there's a sign-up feature, and it's, that's one way to participate. There are two in-person meetings, Cheyenne and Lander, where folks can participate live, like a regular meeting. But back to you, Mr. Chairman, maybe to explain that to Senator Beitman.
Sure, Senator Beitman and members of the committee, we are broadcasting this live on YouTube with 163 people currently watching. There is a chat function for anyone on YouTube who signs in with an account to YouTube, can ask questions of the committee, and I have been looking at the YouTube feed. And so if you see my head going left and right, we've only had, I think, 2 chats so far from Mr. Farmer from the school boards and Ms. Simons from Sheridan County. So, but if any questions or comments pop up today on the YouTube feed, I will bring them into the conversation. Representative Roscoe, question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Noble, I have a question about other states with their income taxes. If they vary, if they tax, higher incomes more, or they eliminate some low incomes for their income tax, or if you know anything about that. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I do have some knowledge of it, and it's kind of all over the board. There are some states that have flat rate income taxes. Some of them are very low flat rate income taxes. The state of Colorado's is 4.63%, I believe, and that's a flat rate. There are graduated income taxes. Nebraska's rises from a low level of 0 all the way to 7.81%. So it's all over the board. There are graduated taxes. There are some that have 2 or 3 different tiers. Some are just a flat tax, allowing exemptions at lower levels. They're all over the board and how they're approached. If you would like, I can get from the tax foundation, there is I have a spreadsheet that has every one of the different rates from all of the states, and I can certainly send that to you. And then I can just send it to the committee in general so that you can have access to it.
That'd be great if you could send that on, and you could either send it, well, I think you have all of our emails, or send it to Katie or Josh and they would distribute it as well. And that information is publicly available. I know several websites have, if you just go through your favorite search engine, they'll tell you that Wyoming, where we rank in our tax rates for property sales, income, or lack thereof. Committee, any further questions kind of on our structural makeup of Wyoming and how our taxation system works? I'm not seeing any at this time, so with that, maybe we could take a 15-minute break until 10 o'clock and come back and jump into the next segment of our program. Let me check one more time with Mr. Tempty or Mr. Richards. Anything further to comment, or Mr. Noble? I think Senator Case has a question.
Just, Mr. Chairman, I was checking to see if there's any public comment, maybe on your end, looking around the room here. I'm full of elected officials now. Does anybody want to comment at this time? Not at this time.
And I do have an online comment from a representative asking about revenue estimates from pipelines. And I don't know, Mr. Noble, do we keep track of pipeline activity revenue estimates?
Mr. Chairman, not specifically. We could certainly do a query of known pipelines and take a look at what is out there. And obviously you'd have to look not only from a sales tax perspective, but also the type of property tax, the amount of property tax that they're paying. We do have that readily available because we do state assessment of gas pipelines. So we could certainly get that information to them.
Okay. Thank you much. Okay, with that, committee, let's take a 12 or 13-minute break. I'll remind you to turn off your microphones and your cameras. And I'm sure Elisa will set up a video feed sign. We'll be back about 10:05. All right, committee, if you're back, maybe hit your screen real quick for me, just so I make sure I have a quorum. 5, 6, 7, that's a quorum. Next up will be property valuation, and please welcome our attorney, Mr. Anderson, to the online video feed. Hi.
Mr. Chairman.
Welcome, Mr. Anderson.
So what I have just briefly is just kind of a background here on the property valuation factors, basically just the constitutional requirements related to those. And then I think the Department of Revenue may have some more information to present after that. But so the relevant provision in Article 15, Section 11 of the Constitution does a few different things. But subsection A there says all property shall be uniformly valued in 3 classes. That's where we get the 3 classes, which are the gross production of minerals, property used for industrial purposes, and then all other property. Subsection B requires the legislature to prescribe the percentage of value to be assessed within each of those 3 classes. And requires the property to be valued at its full value, except for agricultural lands, which are valued on the capability of the land to produce agricultural products. Also, that subsection B specifies that industrial property cannot be more than 40% or more than 4 percentage points higher than the percentage of value prescribed for all other property. Subsection C limits the ability of the legislature to create any other classes or subclasses within those 3 classes. And then finally, subsection D requires equal and uniform taxation within each of the three classes and requires a just valuation of all property, real and personal. Just then a couple of other notes. That constitutional provision was amended back in 1988. And I believe our current rates of 100% for gross products of minerals, 11.5% for industrial property, and 9.5% for all other property have been in place since that time, since 1989. And with that, I stand for any questions, Mr. Chairman.
And we did talk last year that raising the valuation is not in conflict with the constitutional prohibition on mills, because we're not actually adding an additional tax or mill levy. We're changing a valuation rate. Would that be correct?
I believe that's true, Mr. Chairman. I think those are separate issues. And as I said, this constitutional provision, it just requires the legislature to prescribe those values within those limits of the 4 percentage point differences and so forth.
Okay. Any questions for Mr. Anderson's kickoff? Seeing none quite yet at this time, we'll turn it back over to Mr. Noble for his comments and discussion.
Morning, Mr. Chair. Dan Noble again. I have a document that was put in this discussion, and it's referred to as the level of assessment 2020 consolidated impact. And I think it's just a PDF file, so if you folks have access to it, I can kind of walk through what the document actually does. What this level of assessment does is it shows what would happen if we were to add a 2 mil additional assessment to both all other property, which includes residential, commercial, and agricultural, and then add another 2% to the industrial category. The mineral category is already at 100% of its value at this point. By doing so, and this was using the 2019 assessed value, you convert it back to the new level of assessment, adding 2 percentage points to each, and you apply the same average mill levy across that. What is generated is approximately $157 million in additional revenue. And of that additional revenue, 59 million would go to other government, meaning counties, cities, and special districts, and 98 million would go to the school foundation programs and funding education. That's really all this document does. I've set it up so that that number can be adjusted to virtually any change in assessment, level of assessment that you wish. It is an Excel spreadsheet, and I've got it set up where the formulas will actually change it however you wish to see what kind of revenue could be generated. That's actually really all there is with it. It just demonstrates what type of revenue could be raised by changing the level of assessment that is statutory now and could be used to generate additional revenue from the property tax itself.
Representative Connolly has a question, if I could interrupt you real quick and turn it over to Representative Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Noble, I think in the past we've seen what this increase would mean for a typical Wyoming property, like a house that's valued at, 225,000 or something like that, whatever the median is right now. Do you have that off the top of your head?
I have it. Let me see if I can draw up the Excel file that has it. It'll just a moment. Let's see here.
think what the average home price in Wyoming right now is about 218 or so. I was trying to remember the last figures I looked at, but it was a small, modest increase.
I'm gonna look it up from, I know where the documents are at. Let me see if I can find it that way.
So Mr. Noble, while you're looking, we did have a bill last year about increasing this valuation factor on residential and commercial from the 9.5 to the 11.5, but we are doing that in steps. Knowing that it takes up to 18 months, was that how, I guess my question is, when we're doing it in those phased in approaches, even though we were going to step it by 0.5% for up to like 4 years, each one of those wasn't going to go into effect until another 18 months. And so really it was a 3 or 4 year situation we were looking at that time. Would that be correct?
Mr. Chairman, that's correct. You have at least a full year and let me see, a full year and 5 months before you would have the first payment at a higher level. And so the phase in would be, if you were doing a 1/4 or 0.5% each year to get it up to 2, it would be fully 5 years before the full implementation of the new rate would be. On $100,000 of assessed market value, moving from 9.5% to 11.5% would mean, let me see here. I'm just going to do rather than do the math, I'll let the computer do it. Equals minus.
I was doing algebra with my kid last night. Oh, you got it?
$136.84 would be what the average change would be to raise it by $100,000 worth of market value, raising it from 9.5 to an 11.5% rate would cost each $100,000 would cost $136.84, or whatever that, about $11 a month, $12 a month. So that's roughly what you'd be seeing on a $100,000 home. You could double that for a $200,000 home. It would mean about for a home in Cheyenne, $250,000 home in Cheyenne, you're looking at, that times 2.5. For a $250,000 home, you're looking at $342.11 on an annual basis.
Divide that by 12 and
Yep.
about $25 a month. A little more than, yeah, $30 a month.
$28.51 a month for a $250,000 home.
To help save the state's revenues. All right, further questions at this time? If not, go ahead, Mr. Noble. Sorry for interrupting you.
Actually, Mr. Chairman, that's really all that we have as it relates to the level of assessment. This is the impact of it. If you'd like us to make further breakdowns using different percentages, it's as simple as adjusting the rates on the spreadsheet, and it'll provide whatever levels of administration you'd like. If you'd like to see a phase-in approach, we could offer it that way. What it would generate in revenue, and we could look at it as to what fiscal years you could expect to see the revenue impacted at as well. So we could see, anything that the committee would like to see, we can certainly do that. There is a separate document out there that when I saw the topic of tax studies, I figured it might be appropriate for that, but it actually had a place in other areas of the discussion. And that was what the tax rates are in states around Wyoming. And I think we've kind of already discussed that in other parts of our other testimony.
Okay, let's go to Senator Driscoll, and then we'll go back to Representative Sweeney. Senator Driscoll.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question for Mr. Noble, thank you, good presentation, is we're talking about homes, but really this affects all commercial properties and all your ag properties. And tell me what percentages of each of those are paid commercial and ag and what the impacts. I can tell you for myself, those impacts hit ag's basically like a big home, and it hits those guys directly right in the pocketbook. I'd like to know what the different categories are and what they pay.
Okay. In the presentation that I gave in the last session, we talked about what the relative proportion of taxes paid were by each of those sectors. And one of the things that's kind of difficult to show here, in 2018, the amount of the total property tax paid by the agricultural community in the state of Wyoming was roughly 2% of all revenue for property tax purposes. The amount paid by residential property, and to be fair, residential property would include the home site on an ag production, okay? Represents 26% of all the taxes paid, and commercial represents 7% of all the property taxes paid. So you could probably apply those amounts to what would be impacted as it relates to an ag production, not the home. The home would be basically the numbers I just provided, you know, what a 2% increase in assessed value would be versus what is paid by agricultural operations. Is that helpful?
I think so. We're gonna go to Rep. Sweeney, and I don't know if you can move your camera up a little bit, Director Noble. Perfect. A little bit of glare, but we can see your whole face now. Representative Sweeney.
Well, Mr. Chairman, Senator Driscoll had a follow-up. He was trying to get your attention, and I had it on mute.
Got it. Senator Driscoll, follow up.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Well, mainly to explain what this it's the impact that we're going to hit on these businesses that pay huge parts of our taxes. We're at 70%. And these aren't $200,000 homes that they're talking about. We're talking about businesses that are millions and millions of dollars. And to me, this is an area that we got to be exceptionally careful, because these are our manufacturing, our small businesses, all that end of it. And they're paying 70% of it. And this is a burden that comes straight back to them. So I realize we need to be exceptionally careful on all these taxes. But this is, in my opinion, puts unbelievable burdens right back on the people that are hiring our people in small business.
And Mr. Noble, correct me if I'm wrong, but we could have a separate rate for residential and a separate rate for commercial, or an assessed rate for residential, separate for commercial, and separate for industrial. We don't have to tie residential and commercial together. Would that be correct?
Mr. Noble's muted.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I believe that the categories that were created constitutionally, and this might be a question for Josh, because I think he did that piece of the research. I think the categories that were created as it relates to the constitutional provisions were mineral, industrial, and all other categories. There was a separate carve out, I believe, on how you actually value agricultural land, but there is there are those three categories, and I think you would run afoul of the Constitution if you were to try to separate commercial and residential. They're listed separately as it relates to tax purposes because of the different valuation methodologies for them, but it is a category that is defined, I believe, constitutionally, and I'll certainly defer to Mr. Anderson to follow up with that.
And Mr. Noble, we did just put the level of assessment for 2020 up on the shared screen. So committee, if you want to look at that real quick, and if any of you do have any questions, I'll quickly scan the rooms. All right. Seeing none, and we'll make that in the meeting materials as well, but just so you have a visual representation in front of you of what it looks like with our mills and where the money's going and how it's produced and how we assess, those 4 classes. One of our interim topics is on the agricultural lands of the state and looking at, our revenues from that source and what this committee might want to do in that regard. We'll talk about that at an upcoming meeting in 2020.
And Mr. Chairman,
Case.
this material was already on the meeting materials. So it was available to the public, but you had to go to the website to get it.
Yes. I'd also like to respond to Senator Driscoll's comment, because I agree that if you have a property that is worth several $1 million, and let's say it's a commercial property, it will obviously pay more tax than a property that is valued at $200,000, $250,000. Agreed. No argument there whatsoever. But it would still be based on the same assessment increase of 2%. And yes, there would be more paid. The same as if you had a $2 million home, you're going to end up paying an awful lot more property tax on a $2 million home for this increase than you will on a $250,000 home. I certainly agree with that and understand it. The impact is going to be based on each individual and what the value is that their property is worth.
Would it be fair to say that our assessed valuation and taxation rates for property, are they less than all 7 of our neighboring states at this time?
Mr. Chairman, I hate to harken back to the state that I pay an awful lot of attention to, but one of them is they're much lower than South Dakota. And I'll give you an example of their assessed value of all property in 2018 payable in 2019 for taxable valuations in the state of South Dakota was $99 billion in taxable valuation. By comparison, our taxable valuation is roughly $22 billion, and that includes minerals. So yes, it is a significant difference. In the other document that I shared, and it was the tax comparison by state. When you look at Wyoming surrounding states as it relates to, and this is just what a $200,000 home sells for in the state of Wyoming today, and this was from the Tax Foundation. Our tax on that $200,000 home would be roughly, on a statewide basis, $1,160. In the state of Nebraska, that same property would sell for property would be taxed at $3,520. South Dakota, $2,560. Montana, $1,660. Idaho, $1,380. Utah, $1,200, and Colorado, $1,200. So we're lower than any of them, fairly close to Utah and Colorado, but there are states in our region that are substantially higher than we are. One of them which has no sales tax, and that is South Dakota. If you look at all of the states in the union that have not got an income tax, state of Wyoming, $1,160 on that $200,000 assessment. State of Washington, $1,840. Texas, $3,620 on the same assessment. South Dakota, I've already mentioned, at $2,560. Alaska, $2,080. Florida, $1,900, and Nevada, $1,680. And that is the states that do not have an income tax.
Thank you. Hey, we even have a friendly chart for that. Representative Sweeney, you have a question, but I'll have Katie leave that chart up for a bit.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So if we increased the other category up to 11.5%, first question is, does that necessarily have to go through all the distribution process, the normal distribution process, or is there a different way that the state could funnel that to 2% or and my other comment and question to the director is it not true that county assessors are more in charge of the destiny of land value, building values, and I mean we're going through quite a rift in Natrona County right now on both residential, commercial, and industrial properties valuations, land and buildings, and in some parts of town, jumping 333% increase on land costs, while we have $1 million homes at half the price land value, and which makes no sense. And he goes back that this brings him into certification with the Department of Revenue. And I'm like, so is that somehow, that's the second part of the question in regards to Senator Driscoll's comments about how much authority do county assessors really have when they're valuing, even if we went up 2 points? Is it truly certified by the state, or is it a shell game?
Mr. Noble, good luck.
Mr. Chairman, I'll try to answer that. I can tell you that every parcel of property in the state of Wyoming is to be valued at its full value as defined by the legislature, which is really to try to determine what its fair market value is, what a willing buyer and a willing seller would agree to as it relates to the sales price. Now, when you're talking about the hundreds of thousands of parcels that you're dealing with, you have to do it on what is referred to as a mass appraisal basis. So what you look at is you make adjustments to the various parcels of property to develop what is fair market value. You add market characteristics. There's a number of different things. You structure it in neighborhoods so that you can have enough sales within that neighborhood to try to figure out what exactly fair market value represents. Making adjustments for individual properties that may have greater or lesser values because of condition and things like that. So there's a number of different ways that they approach it. There is a science associated with the appraisal process that they follow. And the level of oversight is actually structured through oversight by the department and also by the State Board of Equalization. On an annual basis, each of the assessors submits an abstract to the State Board of Equalization, and that is a statistical analysis of the overall assessment process. Are they falling within the established guidelines of what fair market value should represent in those particular areas? And each county assessor answers to specific questions about their commercial property, their industrial, their ag property, all sorts of these things. And I've been witness to a couple of the orders, one in Natrona County and one in Teton County, where the abstracts were falling outside of the acceptable norms for what constitutes fair market value in their areas, and they were ordered by the State Board of Equalization to adjust the overall process to ensure that sales were being recorded properly and utilized. Those sales were being utilized to determine fair market value for those neighborhoods, and that has been a problem in the past in those areas. The idea is to get them back to where the abstracts at least represent what is considered acceptable norms across the board. Is it going to be identical from one county to the next, you're never going to get there because you're dealing with human judgment and a lot of those things. But there is a certain amount of science that goes into it. And what we're attempting to do is ensure that at least the properties that are being valued fall within those norms. And the problem that you've experienced in that county is that that was not happening for a number of years. And when you consider the fact that property values rise over time, in most instances, unless you have maybe different here in the next year or so, but I mean, typically property values will go up. And if that doesn't happen over a number of years, then I think one of the things that you really need to be concerned with is that maybe you're falling outside of the norms, and you need to, one of the questions you need to ask yourself, and this gets asked virtually anytime, would you sell your house for what its appraised value is on the books? And almost universally, the answer comes back no, meaning that in most instances, the appraised values are very conservative in a lot of instances. When they have to go up as much as they do, it may have been because they were ignored for a lot of years.
Okay.
To the first question, I'm sorry I got him too sidetracked. Mr. Chairman, is there a way, if the legislature did choose to increase, to funnel those extra dollars directly to the state?
Mr. Noble.
Mr. Chairman, as it's currently structured, I don't believe so. This is a local property tax valuation issue. The assessment rate is established by the legislature, but it is still fundamentally a county level collection of this tax. And I doubt without some certain changes associated with that, I'm not sure you could do it. The state actually has the ability to assess mills as well, and it hasn't done so for a lot of years. But as far as diverting those dollars to a specific issue, probably the only way you could do it is increase school mills or something like that. By increasing school mills, now you're not only impacting the entities that you're talking about, which is your industrial, agricultural, and residential, you're now hitting mineral taxation as well, because the mills are across the board for all property.
And we should say that when we raise that assessed valuation, that doesn't just help the state government, that certainly helps counties throughout Wyoming who also have budget shortfalls and significant revenue issues right now. And so increasing the property assessed valuation rate, could you, if you know those numbers off the top of your head, break those down on what goes to the state versus the county, roughly?
Mr. Chairman, in the presentation, I believe all other mills were with a 2% increase in an assessed valuation, $59,005,927 would go to cities, towns, and counties, as well as special districts. So the 8 mills, if the cities are assessing 8 mills, they would get that. The county would get their 12, I believe, and then any special districts that are out there would share in it as well.
Further questions for Mr. Noble before we got him sidetracked?
Mr. Chairman?
Senator Case.
So, Mr. Chairman, if you think about the mill levies, some of them are constitutional, and I believe some are not. But there are a lot of entities that use mill levies. The state really isn't one of them, except for via the school foundation program that we backstop. So in essence, it kind of is a state tax. But it is possible to vary the assessment ratio and then go into the other places where the mill levies are statutory and make corresponding changes there. It's kind of a complex exercise. This kind of one trades off each other in a formula, but of course the county levy and the levy for cities and towns is constitutional and couldn't make any change unless you change the Constitution.
Correct. But it would, statutorily, we would have to do that in the same bill, or, I mean, that might be the easiest, and then hope no amendments. People did interesting things to try to get revenue to go weird places. The difficulty with that, changing the mills the same time you're changing this valuation to try to be equal, is they're all in the same bill, and any number of weird amendments could sidetrack that thing real quick. But I do agree, it would probably be the right place to do it all at once, but it sure seems scary. Thoughts on that?
So, Mr. Chairman, if I may follow up, I'm not really advocating that. I'm just saying that it's technically possible to tweak, in response to Representative Sweeney's question about, is it possible to carve out some of that? You'd have to tweak the mill levies and think about that. For example, if you directed more, if you reduced other mill levies and raised the one to education, that in essence brings money into the state coffers because it reduces the amount that we have to guarantee through the foundation program. But I'm truly not advocating that. It's just a math I'm pointing out the math. The truth is that all our local government partners are in desperate shape. And if this valuation factor were increased, it would benefit our counties and our cities and our special districts and school districts in ways that they probably, based on our current situation, are in desperate need.
It does seem one of the most fair ways to affect people. The unlikelihood of getting an income tax based on the current constitution, as well as sometimes the very wealthy have mechanisms around, what we would consider income, where a property tax increase or a valuation increase would certainly, I would say, be one of the most fair and equitable ways to share in the pain, if that's not the right way to put it. But desperate times, that does seem to be, this proposal seems to be one of the most fair, equitable, and I think something people could get behind, because most people in their local communities would see direct results in their local communities for their special districts, for their city and county. And that's why I guess historically I've been more in favor of a property either tax increase or an assessed valuation increase as one of the most fair and responsible ways. If we have to do something, this one seems the most equitable. Mr. Noble, did you finish your comments?
Mr. Chairman, I'll just stand for questions.
Okay, any more questions from Mr. Noble? All right, not seeing any at this time.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Anderson.
I just thought I'd add on one thing. It was one of the bills referenced in as you're thinking about this issue, one of the bills referenced yesterday in the prior revenue options that had been looked at was in 2019 House Bill 68 school funding revenue. And that phased in 9 mills, but it attempted to do those mills only on the industrial property and the all other property classes, and did not impose those mills on the mineral property. And so just wanted to bring that up as one effort that had been discussed in the past.
That was a pretty good bill. Question, the governor does have at his disposal, I think, up to 4 mills. When I say the governor, it's really the Board of Equalization as directed through the governor. That would affect all classes of property, residential, commercial, mineral, correct, Mr. Noble or Mr. Anderson?
Mr. Chairman, that's correct as it stands now.
And I guess certainly a committee, if we wanted to, we could send a letter inquiring or asking the governor to consider that option, whether that's this committee's prerogative or perhaps if there's a special session at the end of June. I certainly believe that option could and should be on the table as a possibility. As we haven't talked about as much, but the education side of our budget is equally hurting to the general fund. And as we continue to make the cuts we're going to have to make to state government, finding some revenues and really shoring up the education side of our budget deficit, I think is of paramount importance. Representative Roscoe, you have a question?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree that this is probably a good avenue to explore. I just have to bring up one side that I've been hearing a lot about, and that's for the people in Teton County whose house, they're older people, fixed income with extremely high valuations of their house, and they're just being priced out. And I don't know exactly how to address it. I haven't come up with anything myself, but I think that's one issue that we should address if we go this route of raising property taxes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. This whole time I thought that was a backdrop of an outside picture, but you are literally outside right now, Representative Roscoe. Oh. All right.
Mr. Chairman, could I? There is currently in place, I don't know how long it'll be there, but there is currently in place funding for what is referred to as the property tax refund program. And that program is designed specifically for what Representative Roscoe is talking about, and that is to provide some relief as it relates to areas where not only are the taxes high, but also people are on fixed incomes and struggling to make ends meet. It does help them in that respect.
Committee, other questions, thoughts? They want to jump in here. We're running a little ahead of time. We can certainly discuss that legislation from last year now and considering bringing that back in some amended form or a similar bill to what was brought to the House and was not introduced to the floor in the 2020 session. If we would like to pursue that avenue at this point, or we can certainly talk about it here this afternoon. I was just trying to get a jump start on some things. That did not encourage any or solicit any discussion from anyone on the committee, huh? Okay. Well, while we have Mr. Noble, any other questions or comments for our Director of Revenue? Seeing none at this time. Historically, I've never actually run an hour and 20 minutes ahead of an agenda, as anyone on corporations could tell you. And so I'm a bit at a loss of where we should go from here, committee, unless anyone has ideas they want to pursue related to the assessed valuation. Would certainly entertain a motion to have a bill drafted if anybody felt that was appropriate at this time. Otherwise, we will certainly throw that in the mix this afternoon. Representative Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I will make the motion to have that bill drafted and reconsider it at our future meetings. I'd like to go back to the tiered approach of 1% in the next year and another percent the year after. And so that would be raising from 9.5 to 11.5 for residential and commercial, and from 11.5 to 13% for industrial.
A two-part motion. Is there a second? Feel free just to hold up your, seconded by Roscoe. Okay, that motion's on the table. And so as we heard earlier, it would be an 18-month delay for each of those. And so maybe, I don't know, Mr. Anderson, Mr. Tempty's on. By the time this went into effect, it really wouldn't come into the budget until after the current $1.5 billion deficit. Would that be correct, Mr. Noble?
Depending on when you made it effective, obviously it wouldn't be effective for last year's valuation. It would be January of 2021 would be the first time it would be imposed. And the first payment associated with that would be November of 2021. And that would be the 1% increase. And then I think the following year would be the next percent. So you'd have, by 2023, it would be fully implemented, I believe.
Any further discussion on that motion, committee? Looking around, not seeing any hands going up, or Senator Case?
I lost myself. Oh, there I am. Okay, I was trying to unmute myself. Mr. Chairman, I just want to point out a couple of things here. There's a lot of uncertainty going forward about what's happening. We all kind of know that the bottom has fallen out. We don't know if oil might come back by the end of the year. And some of you may be thinking, well, I'd rather wait and have the determination about oil prices. There's also a possibility that the feds are going to bail us out. We might disagree on whether that's a good idea or not. My libertarian senses are screaming, but that could happen and could make up the shortfall in state revenues. It's certainly possible. But any bill that we have now and we put on the table, unless we put it in a special session, which I really do doubt, and I don't think that's likely to happen. That would be somebody else's decision probably. That means we're just putting a tool, we're getting a tool out, and we may or may not pass it at the next general session. Now, we'll know more at the next general session. And, so things have got to come together. And this is, of course, not the final vote on a bill. I point that out too. It's just to have it drafted. But the point I'm really trying to make is that if we don't get things in the pipeline, then when we get to the general session, we don't have anything. And we need to have some tools. And I agree with everyone that the situation could change, perhaps dramatically. I hope for the best. And we may not need these tools. But if we don't begin to create them, then we leave our future legislators and ourselves when we come back in the spring with a mess. And so I would encourage people to support ideas moving forward that we can refine over the course of this interim and actually vote on when we know what the need is. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you. Further discussion from anyone? Representative Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I too think that we should move along a series of bills. We have 4 committee meetings to be thinking about these issues and refining them. As actually both of the chairmen talked about a couple of minutes ago, that this is one of the solutions that is broad-based. And maybe as a committee, we should have those discussions about broad-based or targeted kinds of solutions. But I certainly think that even if the feds bail us out, that's a COVID-19 kind of backfilling. We have some real structural problems that we knew were coming, and they've just hit. They've really hit. And this is not a COVID-19 issue anymore. It's not only a COVID-19 issue. And we have some really, really hard decisions to make going forward. That's much more about how do we restructure our revenue streams to support our economy. That's the discussion that we have to have. And so I would encourage the committee to vote to move this along. And honestly, some of the other bills that we'll probably talk about later. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further discussion? Not, yes, Representative Sweeney.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I would just have to agree with Senator Case. And if we put nothing forward, it is not a good use of the committee's resources. And there's a great talent pool on here, and I would encourage, let's at least get these in the pipeline and to take a look at and work them a little bit and make decisions later in the year if we want to try to push these forward to the full legislature for discussion. It is a general session, and I think it's our role to move those forward, but doesn't necessarily mean I believe it in the voting booth. I would hope that folks will appreciate that you're looking at both sides of the picture. That's my belief, and I would appreciate support on a number of fronts this afternoon and right now. But thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Question,
Mr. Chairman, you've disappeared on us.
call the question.
I feel like I'm being a rebel if I were to take this over.
Do it.
So let's have a raise of hands. All those in favor of having a bill drafted according to the motion, please raise your hand. I've got 1, 2, let me call them out. Roscoe, Sweeney, 2, Conley, 3, not seeing Driscoll, Beitman. I would be 4. Anybody undo your video? And Mr. Chairman, where are you at? I'm gonna wait till he gets back, you guys.
Well, you never hold a vote open for me.
But I think he might even be listening to us. He must be out there. Ms. Talbot, do you know if he was at the Capitol today?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, he is here and I don't know. Oh, now he's in the waiting room. 1 second, I'll readmit him. Oh,
Let's let him in.
yes.
Mr. Chairman, we were trying to take a vote and you were just nowhere to be found.
I'm back. Sorry about that. Internet just went out here. So did we already vote?
We didn't finish it. I'm gonna let you do it.
So I need to call for the roll call vote? Is that what you, or-
It's not really a roll call, but a roll call might be the best. It's confusing on the screen.
Okay, Katie, if you'd call the roll, or Josh?
Okay, Mr. Chairman, this is to have a bill drafted to increase the valuation factor by 2% phased in over 2 years. Senator Baldwin,
No.
Senator Beitman,
No.
Senator Driscoll,
No.
Senator Ellis,
No.
Representative Blackburn,
No.
Representative Connolly,
Aye.
Representative Dayton Selman,
Aye.
Representative Hallinan,
No.
Representative Larson,
No.
Representative Roscoe,
Aye.
Representative Sweeney,
Aye.
Representative Western.
No.
Sorry, Representative Western, I missed that.
No.
Co-Chairman Case,
Aye.
Co-Chairman Zwanitzer.
Aye.
Oh, Representative Roscoe, there you go. We got some wind noise. Mr. Chairman,
Yes, Mr. Co-Chairman.
so I don't think that passed, and but I ask, is this a trend that everybody is going to have on every revenue bill? And if so, how responsible are we being here? What is the issue? And I'd like to explore, are we just all going to say no? This could be your most important time in your history on the Revenue Committee, and are you going to let the state down? I'm just going to throw that out.
Okay. Representative Blackburn, you seem itching for a question.
I am itching. So I don't think we're going to vote no on every one of these. That's for sure. I mean, I can see that we need to do something with the state, but I think we need to listen to all our options instead of just banging out and going, oh, this is the best one ever. Well, I'm not sure that was the best one ever, and neither is the majority. So let's pursue these other avenues that we have and make some decisions. And they're hard. I mean, most of you know where I'm standing. These are hard decisions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman,
Give me just a second, Senator Case, because I'm guessing what you're about to say. I mean, I would say.
I'm going to take the heat off you if I could, Mr. Chairman, because you are
Sure.
chairman.
Go ahead, Senator Case.
That last vote was to put an option on the table for us to reconsider down the road. You just took the option off the table. And if we do that on these, it is not a final vote for passage. But you cannot approach this piecemeal. We need to move these bills along so that we have a package to evaluate against each other, exactly as the good representative said. But if you separate them out and cut them out piecemeal, then you don't have that option down the road.
A fair point. I mean, I would say a property tax is the most equal, fair tax that this committee could pursue in my mind. But if that's not an option this committee wants to take, we have lots of other options coming down the road. How about Senator Driscoll, and then we'll go to Senator Beitman.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Yeah, I have a different opinion about being fair.
Speak loud, please.
I have a difference of opinion on it being fair. I think it hits the smallest group possible. When you look at 500,000 citizens, these property taxes hit inappropriately a different way. And, you know, I'm willing to look at all the different options and areas, but we also have to look at this committee at all of the options on the other end of it as well. And, you know, we don't have all the parties at the table, and I realize time's of the essence, but I'm not going to be party on my end to raising real estate taxes on the people that pay all our bills and hire our people. And so for me, this is one that was an easy no vote. I started to weigh into it earlier. And this is absolutely, there's an old saying when I came in the legislature, most opportune time to kill a bill is anytime you're able to, when it's a bad bill. And that's the action I took. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Driscoll. Senator Beitman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Would it be appropriate to offer up another bill draft idea?
Most definitely, Senator Beitman. Floor is yours.
All right. My idea would be this. Could we get the Department of Revenue to help me with this? What I'm proposing is to repeal the business property tax and make it revenue neutral to a corresponding increase in the sales tax. So whatever that percentage increase would have to be to make up the difference, that would be my bill draft idea. The sales tax, in my opinion, is the most fairest tax. And if you want to get away from taxing and relying on fossil fuels and the extraction industry, this would get you there.
Before I ask for a second, I just want to be clear. You're not actually asking for a new tax or an increase. You're asking for a decrease in property tax with an increase in the sales tax to negate that? Or did I get your motion correct? Or if not, would you restate it?
Mr. Chairman, my motion would be to repeal, a bill draft to repeal the business property tax completely off the books and do a corresponding tax increase to make up for that lost revenue. So it'd be revenue, but it would put the burden more on sales tax, which covers more people. It gets rid of the double taxation of a business buying equipment, paying sales tax on that equipment, and then having to pay property tax every year on that same equipment. It would help the economy, in my opinion.
All right, is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by Blackburn. Okay, committee, I'm looking for anybody who'd like to discuss Senator Case.
Mr. Chairman, it's an intriguing idea. The business property taxes causes difficulties. And just for everybody that's listening, this is where it's called personal property used in business. And it's the tables, chairs, equipment, whatever that a business uses. It's not personal property in our households. And it is definitely an intriguing idea because we've had lots of discussion about it. What I would suggest is we actually do an evaluation and have perhaps a study. Maybe the Department of Revenue could help us to figure that out before we jump into a bill draft. But I think it's worth exploring.
Representative Sweeney?
Well, yes, I definitely think it's worth looking at. I just don't know if we're ready for a bill draft. But I don't want us to, I would probably vote against this on a bill draft because I'm afraid that increase in sales tax is going to be probably 2% to make it neutral, but I don't know that. You know, what if it's only 0.5%? Then it makes a lot more sense, you know, to do that on personal property tax. So I guess I'm in the camp of Co-Chairman Case in thought process. I definitely want to take a look at it, and I have a feeling Department of Revenue, it's not going to take a ton of research. They've probably got a lot of those numbers, frankly, at their disposal. But anyway, just my thoughts also. But I agree, it's an intriguing idea and a different way of looking at it.
All right, Representative Connolly and then Representative Hallinan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I too would like to take a look at it, but if the motion is in part so that it's revenue neutral, that concerns me that when we have kind of the obligation, honestly, to raise revenue or to think about how to raise revenue. And so that concerns me a bit if that was the motion, and that sales tax increase would only be exactly to offset what the business personal property is right now. But I honestly go in the opposite direction of Representative Sweeney and thinking that it's going to be a tiny amount as opposed to a large amount. And then that concerns me. Are we then constrained to that an increase in sales tax would only be 0.25%? But again, that revenue neutral part takes away our obligation to think about diversifying revenue streams. So I'm okay taking a look at it, but I don't think it helps to solve the problem that we've been presented. I think it might solve another problem with the confusion with how we collect the personal business property. But I don't think it solves the problem that we have before us. Thanks.
Okay, Representative Hallinan. Representative Hallinan, your hand's up, checking with you if you have a discussion.
Senator Ellis, we could take her first, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, Senator Ellis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I can email you a chart that I had prepared for our February session. It talks about where those tax dollars are generated. By and large, the personal property tax largely affects our oil and gas industry. So it would, if we went to that, shift that to however our tax liability is in the sales tax world. But I'll email that information out to the committee right now.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Noble, I see you're still on. Do you have any preliminary estimate? I know Senator Ellis said she has a chart. You don't happen to have that in front of you, or an idea of what that number might be off the top of your head?
Mr. Chairman, I do not have it with me. I do know that that information was provided as part of a request for information for a bill draft that would have eliminated, I think, a certain portion of the personal property from reporting requirements. So we can get that for you, and I certainly will. I guess the thing I would point to is, you talk about making this revenue neutral. One of the things that I think you need to understand is that one of these taxes is imposed by county government, okay? And the distribution of that tax is to the school foundation fund, and other school programs, to the cities and counties, and to special tax districts. And I guess I'm not sure how you make it revenue neutral through the sales tax by doing so, because that's a tax that's assessed and distributed differently than this property tax is. And I want you to be aware of the fact that it will create some issues on how you're funding local government at that point, because it is a locally assessed tax.
Okay. Well, regardless if this motion makes it or not, perhaps if you'd certainly look into what those numbers might be in conjunction with Senator Ellis's email coming forward. Representative Hallinan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm unsure what business tax includes. Does that include industrial, or does that include mineral taxation? What does it mean by saying that we're going to replace business tax by the sales tax? So I'd like to have an answer to that question.
Anybody want to try to tackle that one off the top of their head? Senator Beitman, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Hallinan, what I'm thinking is, if you look at all the oil field equipment out there and all that, the pipelines and the equipment that goes into oil and gas and coal production, that's the majority of what this tax is about. It's not necessarily the staplers and printers and the mom and pop shops. So if we're looking at fundamentally changing our tax structure and being less reliant on the minerals industry, getting away from this property tax and pushing it to the sales tax, which is broader and everybody pays it, and it's a consumption-based tax, that's the direction I want to go with this. And the revenue neutral aspect of it is just dollar for dollar. Now, how we appropriate that money, we'll have to look at that. As was mentioned, there's different distribution formulas that would have to change, obviously, and we'd have to look at that, and we'd have to earmark money appropriately to make sure that we're not hurting local governments and things like that. But the whole idea is, from what I'm gathering from this committee, is we need to change our tax structure, and this is a way to do that.
Okay, Senator Ellis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One distinction worth noting, though, is when you purchase equipment for your business and you pay sales tax, that's a one-time transaction. The personal property tax is all the equipment that you use for your business, and it's assessed every year. So there is that important nuance when we're thinking about this issue.
Okay, further, Representative, let me put that hand down. Any further discussion for the committee before the vote? Just show me a show of hands, all in favor of the motion to get a bill drafted, shifting the personal property tax on businesses to a sales tax in an equal amount. Please raise your hand. I have 5. All those opposed, please raise your hand. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. All right, that motion fails. But Director Noble, if you would, on behest of the committee, perhaps be able to put that information together of what those numbers are, I would be appreciative. So, Senator Case.
And that's right, Mr. Chairman. I think it's we should study it. The point about the distribution is a very, very real point. So you in essence have to create a separate sales tax that would follow the distribution. It's really, that's part's really complicated. Could be done. But so if Mr. Noble, I don't think he should spend the rest of his life on it, but if he could give us a report of what that might look like, that'd be good.
Okay. Representative Sweeney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can we make sure that's on the agenda for our next meeting so this doesn't get lost in the shuffle? Because I think it is a good conversation. I think Senator Whiteman's got a good point. And Senator Ellis's information that, I mean, it's the very first page has it all calculated for 2019 is the way I read it. And so I don't think it'll take long of an analysis, but I do want to make sure that this doesn't get lost in all the other shuffles so that we can discuss this and bring it back.
All right, Senator Ellis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, one important thing to consider as we talk and study this issue is the impact that would have on the State Board of Equalization and other tax contested cases. I think it would be helpful for us to know how many of those cases are brought. And if we went away from this valuation of personal property tax for businesses, what administrative impact that might have on those kind of entities or your county boards of equalization.
I think you accidentally muted the last like 10 seconds of that, Senator Ellis. Okay. Representative Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd just like to change gears again and go back to co-chairman Case's kind of question to the committee about what are our next steps and where are we going? And if I could be so bold as to kind of give you my thoughts here, that it seems to me over the past week, we have all gotten the same email messages, those on the revenue committee. And I'd say they're almost half and half. And half of them are, we have to do Medicaid expansion. And I know that that's on the agenda for this afternoon and that we have a management council directive now, right? So that's half. The other half are, we need to look at cuts. We don't want any taxes. That's the other half, right? And I mean, we've gotten at least 50, right, on each of them, if not more. I mean, some days I think it's 50 a day. And so what concerns me going forward is that we have this whole series of bills that are on our agenda. All right, we've got 7 at 1 o'clock, and I even mentioned that there's another at least 4 or 5 from the list that was presented yesterday of issues that we've looked at that I'd like to consider. But I think that it might be important for the committee to actually have that discussion among ourselves to consider how we're going to move forward. I don't want to go through an afternoon where we kind of vote down virtually everything else. All right, the good vice president talked about doesn't like property taxes, but honestly, is there appetite for increasing of sales taxes, establishing an income tax, or going piecemeal? And so maybe if we have a kind of more general discussion for the next 30 minutes or so, you know, among members of the committee about that direction, it will help us with this afternoon.
I think that's fair. I'm certainly open to the conversation, discussion. And I think, well, let me make sure we all agree on the same points. Well, Representative Hallinan, question? I'll let you jump in first.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that we need to look at some cuts. I think about 100,000 out of education and about 100,000 out of the general fund. And then I think we need to have, well, we need to take some money out of LSRA. And we need to borrow some cash. I think it's very important that we have revenue bonds, approximately 500 million. So 500 million and then 100 out of education and 100 million out of the general fund. That's 700 million. And then if we take 500 million out of the LSRA, then we've got 1.2 billion. And that's approximately the amount that we have that's on the table for the amount deficit. I think we have some small tax increases that I favor. I favor an increase in the fuel tax. I favor an increase in the cigarette tax. And I would look at an increase in the liquor tax. Those are small items, but I think they are the items that we need to look at and approve. So that's my thoughts on it, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Representative Hallinan. Senator Case.
Mr. Chairman, thank you so much. I'd like to preface it by saying when we left Cheyenne, we did not have a balanced budget, even before the COVID emergency. we basically were hoping that oil prices would sustain the state in a big way. But the forecast was that our reserves would be depleted with the budget that we left and voted on in Cheyenne. And our reserves were going to be depleted in anywhere from 3 to 5 years, depending on what happened. But so the LSRA was going to be depleted no matter what. And the time frame was 3 to 5 years. Now we have an LSRA that'll be depleted by next summer. And oil prices, which were the only thing we were really betting on, because there's no, I'm sorry, the fundamentals for natural gas aren't good. The fundamentals for coal are terrible. And so the only thing we've been betting on is for oil prices. And they could heal up over this year. Boy, I hope they do, because oil markets are very volatile. But the world is very depressed right now economically. And consumption of petroleum is way down. And there are plenty of folks that are producing oil around the world. So I am not hopeful. I suspect that the Craig report that we heard that shows that being continued, oil prices continued down in the mid-30s into next year, that sounds pretty reasonable to me. I mean, into the middle of next year. So there goes our LSRA. And we would have to keep the LSRA intact, we would have to cut $1 billion, not 100 million here and 100 million there. And we'd have to match that with taxes, you know, if we were going to do it that way, or half and half. You got 500 million in cuts, 500 million in taxes, just to stay where we thought we were when we left Cheyenne just that short time ago. And so that's the point I'm trying to make. We already had a structural deficit. It was very significant. This just takes the wrapping off of it and makes it very clear that it's really not a fixable thing without dramatic action. In regard to cutting, what are we going to do? Are we the Appropriations Committee? What do you want to cut? Just have a bill draft that says we'll cut education by this much and health by this much and whatever? That's really not our strong suit. I think we probably ought to let the committees with expertise in those areas propose the cuts, and they're going to have to do it. Just like we're going to have to step up and try to figure out the most palatable package of revenue increases that we can deliver. I mean, it's our constitutional obligation. There is no other, and it's not going to get better unless, of course, the feds bail us out. But even then, you still have the structural deficit that we had when we left Cheyenne before the news got worse. We need to be responsible, and we got to do it today.
Representative Western, and then I'll go back to Senator Beitman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I certainly sense the frustration in the good senator's voice, and I understand. But I think this is as much of a credibility thing, but of a messaging and an issue of appearances as it is policy. When our state unemployment, we've all seen the numbers, it just went above 9%. It's probably going to continue to go up some over the next 3 to 6 months. Hard to say how much. When the rest of the state is suffering and we come right out of the gate talking about taxes and revenue, I think it sends the wrong message. So I think for us to have credibility when we go to the public, I think we have to be able to go to these people, to go to our constituents, people across the state and say, hey, we're feeling the pain too. We've cut $1 billion or whatever it is. I mean, that's probably somewhere around the mark of what we're going to have to cut out. And we're feeling the pain as well. I mean, all of us have state employees or employees who live in our districts who are on the public payroll in some form or another, at the municipal, county, or state level. But I think we have to be able to go to these people and say, hey, we've walked that walk too. We've walked that plank. We haven't cut a little bit here and a little bit there. We've cut serious amounts of money. They're going to have real pain on real people across our state. I understand at some point there's going to have to be a discussion about revenue. And again, not just a little here and a little there, but meaningful revenue. I understand that. But I think in terms of credibility to people across the state, I think there's going to be a lot more buy-in from the people that we represent, if we can go to them and say, hey, we walk the plank on cutting. And when, again, serious cuts. Now we're going to have this serious discussion about revenue, whether it be the sales tax or any of the other things that we've talked about here today. But I see this as, if we're coming right out of the gate, just gunning for revenue, I think that it gives us with a problem of credibility. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Beitman, you're next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Representative Western. I was right there with you. I agree 100% what you said. The cuts have to come first, or we'll never get the cuts. If we just throw revenue on it and get tax increases, we'll never get the cuts. So the cuts have to come first, and it is a credibility issue. But my other point is this. We talk about getting off dependence on oil, gas, and coal. You're presented with an opportunity to do that, and you soundly reject it. So my question is this. If we're not going to reduce our dependence on them, you saw the bar graphs, that the amount of money that we get in sales tax revenue, property tax revenue, and everything else dwarfs that that we get from extraction, dwarfs everything else. So if we're not going to reduce our dependency on it, then my question to you guys is this. Then what are we going to do to help that industry and help them make more money and support that industry? Or are we just going to suck every last drop of blood out of them while they're dying and just forsake them and say, hey, thanks for everything, guys. It's been a great run, but then throw dirt on them and then move on. What are we going to do to help them? What can we do from a policy standpoint to help them if we're not going to reduce our dependency on them? We're going to base our entire tax structure on the revenue that they generate. They're still generating, even in the down years. You saw those graphs that we saw this morning. Even in their worst years, in the Great Recession, and then the last crash in oil prices in 2017, the amount of revenue they brought in was tremendous. We can't make up that amount of money on an income tax, on a corporate income tax, on gas tax. Guys, if we're going to depend on them, let's help them at least. But what we're doing right now is defeating the whole purpose of it. We can't have it both ways.
I completely agree with that, but I mean, I guess I think the world economy has changed, and we've tried for 20 years to not try to bleed the turnip, but to do everything we can to support and sustain the industry. We all know who pays the bills in this state. But what can we do to further help them? Well, we can reduce taxation rates, which hurts us further. And I know there's a sweet spot between, what we can reduce and what they can produce, and maybe that'll level out. But again, all the economic indicators are going the other way, and it's not a Wyoming issue. We don't control our own destiny in the commodities marketplace in the world anymore. I'm not sure we ever did, but every year we lose a little more, and it slips and it slips, and we can try to keep them going, and we will. I mean, I know Senator Case maybe mentioned we might have 10 more years of coal. I mean, I think there's a future for coal. It's just not Wyoming's 50% of our budget future. And so we are the revenue committee. We're not the appropriations. We're not the cut government committee. We can certainly try to be, but our directive as one of 10 policy committees in the Wyoming State Legislature is to find ways to raise funding. That's what I believe is my directive. I think my co-chairman and I will tell you it wasn't either of our ideas to be the chairman of this committee, but we certainly understand the gravity of the situation, and we're very much with an all hands on deck approach, and everything needs to move forward. 1.5 billion, is an astronomical number that I don't know I can fully comprehend the gravity of what's before us the next 2 years. And so if I can't quite say, what does that look like and how bad is it really? How do I tell the public and get them to truly believe that we have known that we have a structural problem since 2012, right? 8 years. And we've been gliding on the down path, and the LSRA has been saving our bacon. oil and investment income. And the two things you're not going to see next year are oil revenues and investment income. And I hope to gosh it comes back in 3 or 4 years. But I guess we can keep saying how dire it is, but we got to do something. And our charge as the revenue committee is to present options. And I get just as frustrated as all of you talking about the same options. And so I will pledge to you, if there are different ways to raise revenue, I will certainly be going after them and spending the next month every day in the Capitol trying to think of some creative, out of the box, interesting ways. I know the good co-chairman brought a electricity generation possibility. I think we need to explore that. I think it's brilliant. It has real potential if we do it right. But again, I would love to cut everything too, but that's not necessarily our charge from Management Council. Right now, we need to look at ways to raise some revenue, and we should certainly recommend some cuts. And so, Senator Case. I thought you had your
Mr. Chairman, I see that I think that was Senator Ellis, and I see that Representative Conley has a hand up. I'm going to lay low for a while. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Conley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That was, I think, a really good reminder of everything that's before us. And so thank you. And I can't really add to that. I do want to go back to the comments that were made about cuts and showing the state that we're hurting. And it's just that I just have to point out the irony of some of the other work that I'm doing with, I'm not on this committee, and it is on establishing layoff aversion grants, establishing a work share program in unemployment, right? That idea that we need to keep our people working. Right? That's what makes a strong economy, is having our people working, having the money that they get from that employment out into the economy. And we're trying to do everything we possibly can to keep as many people working as possible. And so thinking that we want to lay off people, to me, it is the opposite direction, honestly, than what we're doing on so many of our other committees, where we are setting up programs in the Business Council, where we're setting up programs in the Department of Workforce Services to avoid that, because that's where the hurt is. The hurt is when individuals cannot provide for their families and can't buy things in our communities. So that really concerns me. In terms of the cuts, we heard yesterday from the governor's office that there was a kind of move by the governor to have state agencies address where those cuts could be, and that there will be rescissions, what the governor's office was calling rescissions, and then kind of looking forward to the supplemental budget. All right, we know that that's going on and that's in place. I also agree with Senator Chairman Case, we're not the Appropriations Committee, right? It isn't our task to say we need to cut X dollars from whatever state agency. That's not within our purview. But I also want to bring up, you brought up the good, Mr. Chairman, you brought up the good Senate Chairman's electricity generation idea. You had an idea last year that didn't go anywhere, which was consolidation of government. That was a biggie. All right. That was one where it said, maybe we don't need 23 counties, for example. All right. What would that look like if we took on some of those kinds of issues? So we have opportunities, but I think that we really need to sit back and say, what's our job in this interim? And we need to do it, right? We need to take those steps, because we are in an unprecedented situation in terms of our revenues and moving forward. Thanks.
Representative Roscoe, and then we'll go to Representative Hallinan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have to go back to what Don Richards said this morning about our cuts. We have made some substantial cuts that no one seems to acknowledge even. And I also think we have to operate as a state somewhat like a business. And if we're not paying attention to free markets, I think we're being foolish. And free markets are telling us that things are changing globally and nationally. And so I think we have to accept that and try to move on. And I believe one thing is that if we're going to move on, I don't know how we're going to move on, but infrastructure, education, roads, law enforcement, the stuff the government gives us is really important to maintain. So I don't think there's any question that we have to raise some revenue. And if we put these bills forward, like both our chairmen have recommended, then we can let the whole legislature take a look at it and cut. But if we don't put these tools forward, I think we would be Was I talking to myself?
That was great. Thank you. Representative Hallinan, you had your hand up?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I think what we need is cash. We need about $500 million, and I don't see where we can get $500 million in tax increases. I don't think that's reasonable. And I don't think we can get the other 700 million in expenditure cuts. But I do think that we have the credit. We can do it for ourselves here in the state of Wyoming. We have $1.2 billion that's in the permanent savings accounts. That is our collateral. And we can borrow $500 million and we can take care of the excessive expenses that we have to take care of. We have to cut those expenses by a small amount, maybe 100 million out of savings in the schools and 100 million out of the expenditure for general government. And then we have this $500 million that we can take and use to keep our functions of government going. And we have the cash, we have the collateral. And when a family is in trouble, if they have the collateral and if they have the ability to borrow, that's what they do. And that's what we need to do at this time, because we're in a temporary situation that was brought on by the drop in the price of oil and the COVID situation. Those two things are not going to be permanent. So I think we need to take care and provide the cash that we need to operate our government. And that is approximately, I think, about $500 million. And we need to borrow that. We need to give the legislature the opportunity to sell revenue bonds that would cover that amount of money. So that would be my proposal for this group. And I don't believe that the only function of the Revenue Committee is to raise taxes. I think that's crazy. We look at things how we think. We have a brain that covers more than just taxes. And our brain, I think, needs to be in recognition that we can have some effect on the amount of spending. We do that as an individual legislator. So I think that we need to look at taxes. That's our job. But I don't think that we have to increase them. You know, the full amount of the $1.8 billion or $1.5 billion. I think that's crazy. We can't do that. That would destroy the economy of the state of Wyoming. And we can't cut that by 1.5 billion either. That would destroy our government. So we have to find a compromise. And I think that we need to borrow some money now to keep our government working appropriately. So that's my proposal. And I think it's going to be one that we need to take at this committee level so that the general legislature can look at that. A $500 million option, or at least up to $500 million to be able to borrow. And we have all this collateral. We have 1.2 billion plus another million in the LSRA. So we have the money. We have the ability to borrow on that money. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Representative Hallinan. Next up, Senator Baldwin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple of things on my brain as I sit here and listen. Number one is, I would certainly speak against the 500 million the good representative discusses. I know that's not how I run my family finances. And I would speak and say, we'd all like to think it's going to be a temporary situation, but is it really? And I don't think we know. And, you know, we left in March thinking that this was going to be a temporary thing, that oil was going to come back, and it hasn't. Is that going to be a month? Is it going to be a year? We don't know. And with that in mind, I know that I wouldn't risk my family finances or my business finances by taking out an additional loan. And we may actually end up in a worse place than we are, excuse me, right now. And so that's my first point, is I would speak against that. As to speaking about the Revenue Committee, I think it's our obligation, not just taxes, but we need to have a broader mindset, just like the good representative just spoke. Looking at the taxes, that's certainly one of the things we can look at, but I think there's a lot more sources of revenue that we need to consider, probably outside the box. Sometime in the past year, I know somebody, and I can't tell you who, spoke about we need to have a different mindset, not just in the legislature, but in the state of Wyoming. And that we can't do business as we've always done it. We've got to do things different. And that's a huge mindset change. But I think that's where we need to look. And I don't think we can do that in one day. I think that's a larger process. And it certainly involves more than just the Revenue Committee. But maybe we can get some balls started in that right direction. But those two thoughts come to mind. I would not vote, or I would not look towards borrowing money. I don't think as a sound concept. And I think we need to look at all the revenue options. And I would finally say that we did a lot of cutting here a few years ago for those that were around. Matter of fact, we cut too deep at one point, and some of that money had to be put back in the Department of Health because we actually eliminated some essential processes and programs. And so we need to be careful where those cuts are made. But I think that's a whole legislator thing, an appropriations thing, and not necessarily the purview of the Revenue Committee. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Baldwin. And it's probably one thing we can all agree on is maybe we should change the name of this committee to something like Ways and Means, or what other states have done. Because yeah, revenue just brings out thoughts of taxation in everyone's mind. And you're right, there are other creative ways that we have to chip away at this elephant. And it's certainly going to be cuts. If the executive branch is taking the first round of 20 or 30%, we'll see how that shakes out. But I think as my good co-chairman keeps mentioning, we still have to have options on the table for the full legislature to consider next January. And I think you'll see a lot of options brought in the next special session, whether those are primarily cuts to programs or agencies. That's primarily what I'm expecting to see, but maybe things like a small fuel cent increase or some things to, you know, smooth out the edges, perhaps. With that, Senator Case, any follow-up thoughts before we break for lunch?
And Mr. Chairman, I hope we'd have the opportunity to offer public comment before we break for lunch. I'm sure this might have stimulated some. But Mr. Chairman, I think it's a fair thing to look at some kind of bonding program, and let's see what that looks like. Let's take a look at it. I don't think it's a great tool. I don't think it's a great tool because I want to impress again that this is not temporary. I keep hearing people believe it's going to be better. Excuse me. For the past 10 years, coal has been in decline. For the past 10 years, natural gas has been in decline. And it's been in decline substantially. A third of those revenues have gone away. That isn't a temporary phenomenon. Gas markets are fundamentally different than they used to be when Wyoming was really at the top of the heap. Coal it's just gone, everybody. I wish it would come back, honestly, but the world has truly moved on. We have had a structural deficit and dipped into savings for years now. We've all said it. We've all said we've got to fix it, and we haven't. And this has just exposed the guts of that structural deficit and fixed it so it's dramatic and we have to deal with it. And to the good senator from Sheridan's point, we have been very reliant on the mineral industry. Thank God they've been here for us. They brought Wyoming this far. They built all these schools in Wyoming. They fund us right now. But the minerals don't belong to the mineral industry. They don't belong to this committee. They belong to the people of Wyoming. And we have an obligation to those future generations to get the most we can out of those minerals for them. Because when the minerals are gone, they're really gone. So I'm not inclined to offer tax breaks and things to the mineral industry. I'm hoping that with other broadening of our taxes, as we've said over and over and over that we need to do, and it's been done by many people, that it'll become a smaller percentage over time. But I'm very hopeful that we wouldn't think about offering mineral tax breaks, because frankly, they don't work. They don't increase production. They don't increase revenues. And, you know, we can have that discussion too. But to suddenly throw out ideas that say, let's, we just had an opportunity to reduce taxes on the mineral industry. I don't want to reduce taxes on the mineral industry. It's a bad idea right now. We need to increase taxes in general. And we need to cut a mess out of government to deal with the structural deficit that's been on our plate for 10 years. And I hope this public comment.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. I'm checking in my waiting room. I don't think anyone here has public comment. Is there people in Lander who wish to testify?
Yes, we have people that wish to testify. They're not exactly all on their hands cheering right now, but I have to rearrange if you're ready for that.
Now's good, Mr. Chairman. If you would turn on that camera, we will start public comment video.
Right, and I won't make the mistake I made yesterday with the microphone. So public comment right here, is there anyone go first? And let me get your video up. Have a seat. How about testing the microphone? Shout it out. Hello, 1, 2, 3. Anybody hear me?
Yep, we can certainly hear you. Ready when you, if you have, ready when you are.
Mr. Chairman. In the state of Wyoming.
Hold on, you guys got, my mic has to be unmuted because that's what he's talking on. So don't touch my mic, anybody, okay? I think that's what happened yesterday. Back to you, Mayor Heiss.
I'm also on the Legislative Leadership Committee of Wayne. I'd like to address one of the issues is for the municipalities.
Talk louder.
Our 105. I'd like to address our 105. I know on what the state you were have such a difficult task here. Shout it out, Mr. Mayor. You have such a difficult task you're assigned with, but I'd just like to mention 105. I briefly mentioned earlier, but that is direct distribution money, and more particularly the smaller communities. Some of the smaller communities would even possibly have to close doors without it. I know in Shoshone, we would at least, we run pretty lean. We only have 7 full-time employees. We may be having to cut one of them, very possible. If we lost that, we would probably very possibly be cutting 2. We're getting into people that we actually need just to keep the water going, the sewer going, and keep town hall going. We don't have a lot of that to deal with this. I also like to mention the larger communities. We work together on the VBAL amendment. Or Cheyenne spoke in favor of that, even though it was costing Cheyenne approximately $180,000 a year. Work together as teamwork for what's the best for the municipalities, the best for the state. And I think we should, municipalities, the counties, and the state all work together on this teamwork, because we're all part of the line. But I'd like to remind, the municipalities, really that's the ground roots of Wyoming. Like I said, we're about 650 people, and we're a mid-sized town. I think we're ranked 51st out of 99 communities in the state of Wyoming. So we're not only geographically located in the middle of the state, but population-wise, we're right in the middle. So the vast majority of communities are what people are going to call small communities, and that 105 really impacts us as it does the big communities too. But that was really what I wanted to touch on for today, and God bless you, and you got a very tough job to do, but I'd also like to touch base before I leave. I think we just had a council meeting, we're in our budget sessions, and as Senator Case mentioned, we're looking at all sorts of options on how we're going to balance our budget, and we put some things on our to look at amendments to our budget as we're going through our budget meetings, just to give them, we voted on the table to give us tools to work with. And I'll even say one of them was considered a loan that we was not really high on our list, but we're looking at whatever we need to try to get through this and continue on. Also recognizing that dynamics for revenues change. And this COVID-19 just brought this out, even amplified it more. But like I said, we try to put a lot of tools on the table, so when we evaluate, so if we need it, we can use it. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone have any questions? Seeing none, and I'm fairly certain no one's going to propose a cut 105 million distribution to municipalities, but that's certainly on the table if any member of the revenue committee wanted to throw out that cut out of the current rainy day fund that we are distributing to our cities and towns as we're cutting budgets left and right. That's yet another place we certainly could cut if anyone feels that that's a cut that's justified, as opposed to cutting Medicaid or prisons or Department of Health.
Mr. Chairman, we have another presenter.
All right.
I'd like to make a public comment. Mr. Chairman.
We will await your presenter. Mr. Garrett, welcome.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Richard Garrett with the Nature Conservancy. First, I'd like to offer some personal comments, not on behalf of our organization, but I acknowledge I am a very lucky person. I was born in Wyoming, and I have benefited from taxes on the mineral industry for 6 decades or more. And I think it's time I get a chance to pay my way. So speaking personally, I am glad to pay an income tax if it comes to that, and glad to pay an increase in property taxes as well. I recognize that I'm unique in that respect. I have the ability to do that. I'm confident that the state legislature, our citizen legislature, can work through the details so impacts are minimized to people that are not as fortunate as I. Now, on behalf of our organization, and I realize that Joint Management Council suggested, or in fact perhaps directed, that the Revenue Committee not look at the production tax on renewable energy resources. But that was 3 weeks ago, and the world has changed incredibly. And I think it's time that we look at that opportunity very seriously. The Nature Conservancy can help guide that policy discussion. We can figure out ways to incentivize renewable production that is cited correctly in the state of Wyoming and disincentivize production that is not cited correctly. So we can benefit conservation and we can benefit our state's bottom line. With that, I stand for questions.
Any questions for Mr. Garrett? Seeing none, thank you, Mr. Garrett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Is there any further public comment in Lander?
Let me check. Any further comment here? They're saving their powder, Mr. Chairman. Look out. Thank you.
Thank you. No further public comment. Diane, let me check the chat room real fast. All right, I don't see any other further public comment committee currently. So how about we take lunch and we reconvene, let's just say 1 o'clock. And we'll talk about the various bills that were considered in the 2020 session, some that made it, some that did not, as well as any other issues or legislative ideas the committee wants to bring forward. We will have some people joining us who have asked for public comment, as well as have the Cheyenne and Lander site for public comment. I have been watching the YouTube video. Several people have been commenting on everything from a more diversified economy to we need to be business friendly and not raising taxes, to saying that we should look at some tax increases compared to other states. We are drastically lower than all of our surrounding states, and that we benefit from the mineral industry, which is the recurrent theme we talk about a lot in this committee. So with that, committee, enjoy your lunch, and we'll sign off and be back here at 1 o'clock. Remember to turn your videos and microphones off. And also, if you're watching on YouTube, remember we will have a separate video stream for this afternoon. So you'll need to log back on either YouTube or the LSO website to access that video feed. Thank you.